Ooh, we're live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming through the rain. I think that's so important what the Illinois Science Council is doing, and I think it's so fascinating when you remind us that, yes, 85% of us here in the U.S. are over the age of 18. We are goddamn citizens, aren't we? And we should maybe know more things about science, just off the cuff, right? But you don't have to have a PhD to have it. And I would also say, in terms of making decisions and healthcare decisions, there was that beautiful recent paper, wasn't there? 80% of healthcare decisions in the United States of America are made by women. 80%. Why? Well, mostly sexism. We're the primary caretakers of our old people and our young people and our medically frail relatives. But if there were anyone in the US that needs to have a good handle on how bodies work in general and how science intersects with it, oh, I think it's adult women here.
Yes, and I would say, and those who make policy about healthcare and adult women ought to know a thing or two about science and about human evolution, you know? So that's my take, and that's why I think this book is so interesting, is that my background, for the record, by the by, my background is not in science. My background is actually in policy. I feel like that's a big reveal I have to explain about Illinois Science Council. But it's because I think it's so interesting. And so I don't have a background in evolutionary biology. It's not the sort of thing I would normally pick up. But this book is phenomenal and interesting and engaging and funny. But so one of my basic questions is, certainly there have been a lot of books written about evolution of humans. So what drove you to do this one with this angle, which is so unique?
Oh my goodness. Now, as a cis woman who's lived her life in such a way, these are not small, I would say there are many points in my life that are, what would we call them? Triggering. Yeah, but I would say probably in the exact moment at which I knew we needed a better story about our evolution was actually watching a sci-fi film. How many of you have seen Stanley Kubrick's 2001? Okay, the majority of you, good. I'm a big Kubrick fan. There's a really classic scene, and if you ever read the script, it's called The Dawn of Man, okay? Put aside your feelings about that word, but all right. So you have this scene, and it's actually a bunch of American and British mimes, I later learned, in ape costumes, but it's fine. You're supposed to be early hominins, right? And they're out there, and they're like in some dusty, scree-filled landscape. There's no food. I don't know how they're living. Anyway, it's a very unfertile zone. It's also very unfertile because, as far as I can tell, there are no females and no babies, okay? Which, for any primatologist, is like, what now? Yeah, so this scene is supposed to be the moment where we invent tools, right? Because there's a conflict with a neighboring band of hominins, also the mimes and the ape costumes. It's fine, we love Stanley. Anyway, and one guy ends up picking up a bone and having this alien light, actually alien for Stanley, shining in his eyes, bangs it on the ground, figures out that he can use it as a tool and goes to beat the crap out of the other troop, and thus is born all human invention, I guess. You know, you follow, the Blue Danube starts to play, you follow the bones spinning up into the air, and it transforms into a spaceship, and suddenly we're in a spacefaring civilization. But as I'm watching this, and I'm like, I don't know, 12 or something at the time, I'm like, where the hell are the chicks? You know? Like, I hadn't even entered puberty yet, but I was like, how exactly is evolution supposed to happen here? That's a whole lot of penis in one room. Like, how is it that, are we just in the backyard? Are we like over a hill, just like pounding on a tuber? Sorry, guys,
Yeah,
I
or
see
back
you're
home
doing
in the
something
kitchen,
important,
right? Yeah.
with a bone. I'll just quietly like build the future of our species in my womb. It's cool. Yeah, you go on. It's all right. Something about spaceships. Right? And so that little seed was always in my mind, from the 90s forward, like. And I saw all these books come out, and I read all of them, and I loved them. There was, there have been recent bestsellers. There's Harari's *Sapiens* has sold 12 million copies. If you don't know, that's a lot for books. And there's, of course, *Guns, Germs, and Steel*, and Richard Dawkins likes to say many things at length in various formats. Some of them are really beautiful, some less so. Maybe he could do less Twitter. Right? So I just thought, of all of these stories of where we come from, we keep leaving out the chicks. We keep leaving out the females. We keep being rendered side characters. which
And
is so strange.
Yeah, and it strikes me as just that point that we've all heard this thing that it's the growth, the evolution of humans is about the tools, which are all about the killing of prey, which is all done by the males in our vision. In the cultural milieu, that's what we've all been taught. And so that's why I think it is interesting to say, well, wait, you're right. How are they looking at things from the female perspective? It's not even female perspective, it's just looking at females of the species.
Or just acknowledging that we're here, just being like, you exist. Just that would be good. Although to be fair, to Stanley, like in the biological and biomedical sciences, there has been a noticeable gap of the study of females that we're only just starting to rectify. And from there, we're finally starting to diversify our understanding of what sex even is, and that it's nuanced, and that it's not a binary, right? But even starting with moving from a mono model of one sex, just studying males in the lab, which, if you don't know, we have been doing for a very long time and only recently changed, to a dual model is a major paradigm shift.
Yeah, and understandably difficult. I think it's some work done at Northwestern here, in fact, that was heavily about recognizing if all your clinical trials for devices and medications are being done solely on male subjects, well, that really skews things if you're a female and you're getting treated for heart disease or what have you.
Sometimes it doesn't matter at all, okay? The Tylenol you take, pretty much sex similar. You don't have to worry about your Tylenol, right? But how many of you have ever had insomnia? Yep, pretty common diagnosis. About 40% more likely to be diagnosed with insomnia if you have ovaries and you haven't hit menopause. And then there's another boost with menopause because menopause sucks. So I hear. Haven't done it yet, but so I hear. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know what it is that's keeping us up at night. Neither does anyone else. It could be hormonal influence. It could be the existential dread of just having ovaries these days. We have it all, right? Like there's a lot of things that might strike us as something that would keep us up at night, but the simple fact is that we do. Well, one of the most common medications for insomnia is Ambien, okay? And some while back, we finally realized that female patients need to have half the dose of male patients, which wasn't the original guidance, you see. About 5 milligrams instead of 10, okay? Now, why did we learn that? We learned that because of car crash data, okay? We learned that because over time, filtering in through the Department of Transportation, actually, but then also hospital data, we finally put together the picture, we, science in general, not me, I wasn't involved, that female patients who'd taken an Ambien the night before the recommended dose were more likely to get in a crash on their way to work the next morning, if they were people who drove cars, of course.
So that's kind of an important finding, I would say.
Of course, at that moment, the med had been on the market for 21 years. We can do better. We can do better. We can speed that up a little bit. And we have been. This book wouldn't exist if it weren't for all of the amazing research finally coming out about sex differences now. And it's reshaping not only how we understand how our bodies work and what health looks like and what treatments should be tailored depending on your sex and where you are in your life, but also how we understand the story of our evolution as the Homo sapien species.
Yeah, and I think that part of it, what I think is so interesting is that looked at from the current standpoint, okay, we have these hugely evolved medical system and medical research systems that, of course, can accommodate females and should, and thank God they're doing better. But trying to look at it from a scientific evolution standpoint, can you talk a little bit about that research? Because we don't have fossils of ovaries or uterus or human brains and that sort of thing. So how do we start to understand the current female form from the way we study all these other things that matter from evolution?
So the very first blurb, there's a weird thing that happens in books. People write blurbs to, like, recommend your book. It's all those quotes on the back. Your publisher seeks them out. The very first blurb we got was actually Bonnie Garmis. The second blurb that we got was Neil Shubin from over at that field
University
Museum.
of Chicago, right here.
Who was a wonderful support for this book. And he'll
Did
be
you all come to our talk? We did a talk when he did his first book on Tiktaalik and the discovery of the fish that walks.
Yeah, we love Neil. He's a good.
Highly recommend
Woo
that
for
book.
Neil.
Read this
Absolutely.
book and that book in companion.
I don't
Really
talk a
good
lot about
combo.
fish, but it's all part of the story.
Yeah.
Exactly. So Neil would be happy to tell you that soft tissue does not survive in the fossil record. What we do have, or does not regularly do so, what we do have, however, from the hominin line is the pelvis. Not nearly enough of them. Everybody would like more hominin fossils, thank you very much, to do better research, but we do have the pelvis. And some very good scientists did a very careful analysis of the female pelvis, the presumed female pelvis, in the hominin line over time. So going back millions of years. You probably remember Lucy, 3.2 million years ago, our happy little Australopithecine that we presume fell out of a tree to her death, or maybe was just crushed over time. We don't know. Anyway, she met her end, but now she tells us a lot about our ancestors. And by looking carefully at her pelvis, among others, we got a very different story about how females evolved in our line. You see, she shared something with us called the Obstetric Dilemma, which is to say, by roughly calculating growth rates and how big the clavicles would be, remember, it's the shoulders that usually get stuck coming out of the pelvis. I know it's alarming to think about. This is squishy. That's why they all come out hideous with cone heads. Yeah, but this is not. These are the rigid. The clavicles are rigid and are the things that usually get stuck if something's going to get stuck, okay? Because they have to support our giant, stupid heads. That's what these are for, as our neck muscles finally build up. Right, so Lucy probably got a decent amount of what's called shoulder dystocia when she gave birth. Her babies were getting stuck too, in other words. She had giant babies coming out of a tiny hole. By the time you arrive at the human line, we have a watermelon-sized thing coming out of a lemon-sized hole. And if you've met fruit, it's a problem, right? And so there was this beautiful paper that's been built on since that shows that, oh, well, Lucy probably had a midwife, actually. She wouldn't have had language yet, my God, who wouldn't even necessarily claim consciousness in the way we assign it to humans and not non-human primates. Check with Peter Singer on that. But the general rule here is, like, she could not have done that very easily without social support, without the social environment, the culture that could support somebody helping her get through this terrible thing called hominin birth. As our brains got bigger and our pelvic inlet narrowed, it only got worse over time. So what I do in the tools chapter of the book is I say, oh, well, that was our biggest problem, right? Tool use is about overcoming a body's limitations in its given environment in order to achieve a goal. Animals that are bad at reproduction, and human beings are, and a lot of the hominin line was, with our invasive placentas and narrow-ass birth canals, had the biggest problem there is. In evolutionary biology, this is called the hard problem. You can limp around on one foot, you can see with one weird giant eye, but if you can't make babies easily, you are probably headed for extinction. We're at 8 billion people now. I argue the only reason we are is because we invented gynecology. And Lucy is probably among the first that did it.
And I do think that is the part that clearly never dawned on me, that idea of gynecology as a tool, something that is to benefit us as the limitations of our bodies. And because there's not really a way to study from the fossil record how that came to be, but you spell it out quite clearly that if we were to be what we are now, clearly this had to happen in the various precursors to the humans, to Homo sapiens.
You can infer things about cognitive capabilities from what is in the fossil record. So we do that a lot with stone tools, for example. The big secret of paleoanthropology is they don't give a shit about rocks, okay? They don't. They know a lot about rocks. They do not care about rocks. They care about what a given stone axe might tell us about the cognitive capacities of its potential user and what it might have been used to do in a given environment, right? It's that triangulation. That's their whole damn field. Triangulating what we could, they're secret behaviorists, you see. They're all trying to figure out what these damn creatures were doing with this thing, which they deduce is probably a tool, and how it's used given the environment and mapping climate change, what have you, depending on the researcher, right? So if the fundamental feature of tool use is, yes, that it's problem solving, but more importantly, it's about doing things with behavior to overcome physical limitations, then the most important question is, what was our biggest physical limitation? Oh, it's our crappy ass vaginas. Obviously, that's, well, it's not the vagina. Technically, it's the pelvic opening
having
around it.
babies,
that thing stretches. But yes,
having them safely in a way that the mother survives this rather traumatic for both involved, I guess, but this very traumatic thing, right?
absolutely. And importantly, like any good OB will tell you today, the success of a birth, whether or not you're likely to survive it without becoming crippled, whether or not the child is likely to survive the process of getting out of you, is greatly shaped by the entirety of your life before that moment, right? So it's not just about midwifery. It's not just about getting them out. When you have deeply invasive placentas, it's also about your patterns of reproduction, what age you are when you give birth, whether your body is fully matured, what kinds of social support you have received. Have you had adequate food up to this moment? Do you have social allies in this moment? Which is to say, the umbrella of gynecology isn't simply midwifery. It's all kinds of behavioral innovations and practices that build cultural knowledge that eventually human beings take on to keep more females alive in a given environment, right? Or at least that's the idea.
Right. Idiot. More alive. And I do think it's interesting because we think about it from such a cultural perspective. Duh, we want to survive. But recognizing that genes don't think culturally, but they are about, that's the whole point of evolution. They exist in ways that what will continue the species line, propagate the species.
Absolutely. There's nothing in our genes that encodes for like a speculum. Okay, let's be clear. We're deeply social primates, however. We're profoundly driven to make culture, to create new cultural norms, to create new rules. We're knowledge sharers. Even before we had language, this was probably true. You can see it in other social primates, right? But certainly once language is online, oh my gosh, then we are off to the races. Yeah.
Right, that evolution, and that makes me think of everything I've ever seen or read about when you talk about primate culture, meaning chimps or bonobos or orangutans or what have you, is that this social aspect of it, and that's what sets us apart. Yes, there are social animals, but what is it that sets us apart? It's that language, and therefore that transfer of knowledge that just explodes.
Absolutely.
The growth
Although
of
you
humans.
can have, as you know, cross-generational transmission of cultural knowledge and practices. There's that famous group of, I think it was olive baboons, who discovered that they could wash bits of grain in tide pools, and that got the kind of grit off of them. But then it was also true that it made it a little saltier, a few more minerals. They kind of liked it. And then you see generations later that they're still washing their damn food, in the tide pools, and that continues to be a thing. It's not the case that you have to have language to transmit beneficial behaviors or cultural norms around behaviors. You don't need language for that. Monkey see, monkey do. Monkey mom teach monkey baby, primarily in non-human primates. That's the thing. It's very much a female-taught situation. But I think when it comes to gynecology, yes, language was going to be a hell of a boost for medical knowledge and practices. Absolutely.
Yeah, and speaking of language, the whole section about the development of language, not just from previous species, but also from human babies, that they don't come out talking and they have to learn it, but it's also physical. And it's my personal thing is, my mother in her first career was a speech pathologist. And so I was raised with her understanding of studying how children learn from siblings about it. And now, because the universe has a sick sense of irony, she has been afflicted with a condition, a neurological condition that has robbed her of her ability to speak. And so I think it's really interesting that you're talking about the researchers can see in the evolution of primates certain things that must have happened. If you could talk a little bit about that, what we've seen has happened that makes humans different from those previous things. Something had to change. And then also, I think what's interesting is how the babies can't talk, even if they understood it well enough, couldn't talk from the get-go.
Yeah, I think speech is such an interesting thing, isn't it? We really call ourselves the talking ape. And of course, there's great focus on vocal speech, though there is a beautiful and rich community of people who speak with their hands in the deaf community, who would very much like us to know that actually it's more of a brain thing, thanks. To be the ones who speak. But nevertheless, in the evolution of speech, there's been a lot of focus on the apparatus, the vocal apparatus, yeah? And there's been more recent interest in possible sex differences in the vocal apparatus. I think the most important changes probably happened in the evolution of the human brain, to be clear, to enable speech. I think Pinker is right, there is a language instinct. I think Pinker is deeply wrong in that he thinks mom doesn't matter. There's a whole historical reason why he wrote the book, The Language Instinct, which is, I think, as I say in my own book, a near-perfect book, it's a part of that legacy of the Cultural Revolution, setting aside Freud, enough saying that your mom makes you everything that you are. There's a history of science moment happening in his work, is what I'm saying, okay? My father, for those of you who don't know, was a research psychologist and worked in language development. Okay, all right, so the thing is that there are critical windows of language development where if you don't have a working communicative dyad, that means pairing of two, where language development just doesn't seem to work quite right. Okay? And the most critical phases of language development happen in the first 3 years of life. Remember that a baby has no idea what the milk beast is chirping at her, okay? No idea at all. They don't even have a sense yet of what a word is, okay? So it is a stream of barely punctuated signal, right, that they're first receiving, right? It's just going front to back. One of the first most important code-breaking moments is figuring out that you can segment that crap. Okay? And then you actually have words, and then you start to realize the beginnings and ends of words might matter. And then, right? So there's a lot of code breaking that is deeply aligned with really important brain development in those early phases of life. What I think a lot of researchers are starting to return to is how important the dyad is, because it just so happens in the human lactating species, those first few years of life are strongly correlated with the period in which you are breastfeeding. Okay? That doesn't say you can't acquire language without breastfeeding. It's just that you happen to be attached to the chest wall of a language user for the first critical periods of language development, staring up at her while she chirps at you. Okay? That this is obviously one of the most important communication dyads that you can have.
And it's just such a given, an assumption. Of course it happens, and mothers sing to their babies and talk to their babies.
We
they
say
don't
all
have
kinds
to.
of dumb stuff to our babies. I have two. Oh my goodness. Yes.
Yeah, they don't have to. They don't do it all the time, but it's just such a, never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
That of course that is the origin of the baby getting language.
It's one of the important origins. I think origins. I do think that there is such a thing as a language instinct. I think human brains are generally born hungry, as it were, to acquire language and do that code breaking. But one of the things that was really interesting is the vast majority of humans that have been studied produce something called child-directed speech, more colloquially known as Motherese. Males do this too. People of all genders do this. We even do it to our damn dogs. The scientific term for that is doggerel. Okay? Who's a good baby? You're a good baby. Who's a good baby? You're a good baby. The pitch is going up and down. I'm stretching out my phonemes. I'm doing all kinds of stuff musically, rhythmically, and in pronunciation with exaggerated facial patterns. The vast majority of humans do this in nearly all cultures that have been studied. But interestingly, it seems to give you a language learning boost, okay? Chinese-speaking mothers, Mandarin-speaking mothers who use their version of child-directed speech are better at learning the tonal language, okay, that they speak. In English and in French and in German, many studies have shown that exposure to child-directed speech boosts your ability and speed to become more fluent in your native language, which is to say you don't have to have it probably to become lingual, but it helps.
So talking to your child or your dog like another human, well, dog, will you please do this? Baby, will you do this? Isn't quite as good as this innate thing we go, oh, isn't that good? Do this.
Now with the dog, I don't know that it helps the
Well,
dog
yeah,
at
we
all,
don't
to be
know.
clear. I think
Your
the dog
dog,
is
I
like,
don't
you're
know.
real dumb. Can I have food though? Yeah.
But I think also that little bit that you said that babies' cries start mimicking the cultural way that, you know, a baby's cry, the musicality of language, that if you're a French baby, your cry actually starts to mimic the way French people talk or the Chinese people talk.
Yeah.
Mind-blowing little fact.
Yeah. You are, if you are a normally hearing person that developed in the womb with ears that do the average thing that ears do, you do come out crying in a way that is weirdly mimicking of the musicality, the prosody of the language that you encountered in your watery environment. Yeah, that's real weird. I believe it was that French cries go down, whereas German cries go up, but I can't remember the exact paper. Anyway, it was real cool. Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to move on to that other, the notion that I remember learning about that, okay, we know bits, you know, all these bits and pieces about the birth, how females evolved, but this whole idea of older females. I happen to be particularly interested in this. I don't know why, getting older, but, and this idea of why do human females live past fertility phase?
Like, why aren't you dead? You should obviously be dead.
I should be dead. I think I'm okay that I'm not. But right, that idea of learning the grandmother hypothesis. I am not a grandmother. I will never be a grandmother. But I think, so I'd heard that before, and I thought, of course, she's going through the book going, she's going to explain this grandmother hypothesis thing to me. And what I think is interesting, if you could talk about that your research is not disputing it, but rather saying that it's seemingly incomplete.
I tweak it a bit. I tweak it a bit, yeah. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the grandmother hypothesis essentially runs like this. It is true that it's one of the great mysteries in biology. Why does the human species have females live a full third of their adult lives not ovulating? Not a normal thing in mammals. Pretty much we just keep rolling it out until we kick the bucket for the vast majority of species. Why, right? Okay, well, the grandmother hypothesis says, it's for the grandbabies. Obviously, you and your daughter are not going to compete for mates if you're not ovulating anymore, which is a whole porn scenario that we can just set aside. But nonetheless, right, there are local resources, there's limited food, okay, and it costs things to be pregnant, which is to say, okay, so you're not in competition with your daughters, and maybe that's a beneficial thing for the granddaughters. Okay. But then also it says, God, our babies are really terrible, aren't they? They can't even hold up their heads forever. This is the grandmother hypothesis, not just me, right? And so maybe it would really help to have somebody not taking care of a baby of their own help with the helpless babies, right? So it's the very scientific argument for free daycare. Like that's the argument for menopause. That was going around for a long time, still very prevalent. Now, the funny thing is we've recently discovered that we are not the only species that has menopause. Turns out there are, I believe, 4 different species of toothed whale. And of them, the ones we now know the most about are orca, transient orcapods, killer whales. They are obviously hard to study because boats ocean, drowning, right? So, and they're long-lived, a bit like us. So that means, a researcher wanting to track a female her whole life may well end his or her career before publishing. So there are many problems with studying these questions. However, a really beautiful paper came out that took the teeth away, if you like, of one of the big parts of the menopause, the grandmother hypothesis. The matriarchal orcapods do not have the menopausal matriarchs take extra special care of their grandbabies. They're not giving extra food to the grandkids. They're not spending a lot of time making sure the sharks don't do the thing. Like, that's not a major feature of their behavioral suite.
Which is what you would expect the grandmother to be doing, benefiting
if
the children.
Menopause is all about the free daycare, except in water this time, right? Okay. What they were doing is in times of stress, particularly when local food sources, go-to food sources had run a bit thin on the fish, as it were, they were the ones that led the pod to good food sources that were more rarely used. They were also instrumental in teaching younger generations key hunting techniques. Like, that cool thing where killer whales will line up and like bum rush an ice floe so that the bow wake will knock a seal off the ice. Really bad day for the seal, but very good for the orca, right? The grandmothers are involved in teaching subsequent generations how to do that. So, which is to say, at least in that species, it's been a very long time since we've been genetically related to anything like cetaceans, to be clear. But at least in that species, which has this convergent evolution of menopause, the elderly menopausal grandmothers are not the daycare. They are the wizened generals, okay? They're valued for their knowledge, frankly, or whatever orca knowledge would be.
Yeah, I'm
exactly.
really digging this idea that wanting to see value in wisdom that comes with age. We have to tell employers that, but continue.
Working on that. Hey, my husband works in tech. Apparently you die when you're 40.
Yeah.
So, in San Francisco has many problems right now. Anyway, so yes. So that means, in other words, it would be a little bit stupid to think that wouldn't have been true of ancient populations of human beings. Like maybe the daycare as an add-on perk, like that could be cool in certain cultures, right? But actually, in times of stress, what you really have in hypersocial species like ours, which live in complex societies that are interdependent, no matter their size, what's really useful is having someone around who literally has lived through that stuff, who remembers the flood that hasn't happened for 30 years and how they managed to build back after that, right? Who remembers that weird spree of death that came that one time, right? And managed to survive it, that literally no one else is old enough to remember.
So it makes sense to me when you start thinking about that of ancient hominin species, of saying, okay, well, do we have people who are old enough to remember a flood, a drought, or whatever crisis that befell the troop, and also can help them get through it without being distracted because she's currently giving birth?
Well, certainly the currently giving birth would be, distracting. But that's a rare event in one's life. We only actually do it a few times, even in our ancient context. It's not a constant state of giving birth. Frequently pregnant, not frequently giving birth. But there is a thing that is important there, because I think the twist that I found in the scientific literature in the menopause hypothesis is the idea that menopause is something that was revealed as a trait. If the entire species selects for longevity, male and female alike, right, but the ovaries are still running the old monkey plan, then menopause is revealed as we live longer. And indeed, in cross-species comparisons, it does seem that our ovaries are running a pretty standard primate rate of senescence. They're aging a lot like other primate ovaries might age, very similarly so, right?
Meaning the human ovaries are declining at the same rate that they are in other primates.
Roughly.
And that it is a decline. Like, we know this much about it. It's a decline.
Which is to say, the ovaries didn't quite get the message that the average lifespan might end up being freaking 80-something.
Yeah.
Right? They're still running an old 35 to 50 as our max.
To me, it just sort of raises the question. It says, well, But we didn't have lifespans well past 50 for a very, very long time. So it kind of makes sense. Yeah, we all should be dead by now. I should have died at age 12 from appendicitis, but thankfully to modern medicine. So the idea that, okay, well, it just so happens that modern medicine has now prolonged our lives past it.
It's not just modern medicine. It's also our sociality, to be clear.
Right.
It's our emphasized interdependence and caretaking. So in most extant, that means living, hunter-gatherer societies that have been well studied, the rate of death before age 5 or so is about 50%, usually from infection, sometimes accidents. Accidents usually take you out later. Mostly it's infection. And there's no good reason to assume that wouldn't have been roughly the case for a good chunk of our 300,000 year history as a species, right? So that influences how you calculate what the average age of death would be, right? It actually statistically moves the numbers around if you have a lot of early life death. So then you say, oh, of those who live past age 5, how many then go on? And then you can see even in a hunter-gatherer society, it's not 35, it bumps up. But there is a general estimate that for a huge portion of hominin history at least, we were kicking the bucket 35 or so. Yeah. Or maybe we were a bit more like the modern chimpanzee or bonobo, that, yeah, you can live to 60, but you ain't doing well. You have teeth falling out. You have clumps of hair falling out. You are falling the heck apart. You're more like a centenarian if you're a 60-year-old chimp. However, you are, if you're a female in that moment, the most attractive member of the troop, actually.
That's a fun fact.
All the chimps are into grannies. It's a thing. It's a real confusing thing that you can look up on your own, but they are.
Jane Goodall, prove this, or
she
through her observations?
I think Goodall did some of this research, but it's also been seen in captivity. It's been seen in general that the older the female is, the more desirable she is. So, okay, that didn't quite work out for us in most of our societies, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah, so that sort of goes to
I'm going to let her pivot from there.
Yeah. Well, it is about that idea of trying to understand how much is cultural, Hollywood magazines, when we're talking real current life experiences of social species like ours, versus how much of that comes from the evolution of, we evolved from social species. We can look at all these other social primates. I guess a part of it would say, can you talk about some of the other distinctions and differences that you're seeing that are part of this evolution between males and females?
Physiologically, behaviorally, what you going for?
Well, that's what I was sort of saying, starting with the physiological, because I was starting to think about, we're talking about death, the things that there are certain things that are so much worse for females. I love the factoid that pregnant women are more susceptible to malarial mosquitoes than males are, or more susceptible to depression, more susceptible, I think you said not more for heart disease, obviously certain kinds of cancers, ovarian cancer, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but males of
males
all ages get way more cancer, just in
so
general.
men get more cancer.
They also get more infections. Their immune system kind of sucks. Yeah.
Of all kinds of infections?
There is a special subset of infectious diseases that are well studied by epidemiologists, where females are more vulnerable and then suffer more from. However, if you're counting actual diagnosis of infections, incidence of infections, and types of infections, males get it more throughout their lifespan. Yeah. The only variation there is when we're pregnant. That's when all kinds of bodily mayhem happens, because the placenta downregulates the maternal immune system for obvious reasons. Otherwise, the uterus would treat it like a tumor, which technically maybe it's a partial allograft. Yeah, a little tumory. Not actually a tumor, but tumory, right? It generates its own blood vessels. Yeah, right? So you have to evolve in a way that then manipulates the maternal immune system in order to permit pregnancies like ours to go on. But that has knock-on effects in the rest of our body as well when our bodies are pregnant.
And I think it's just that just strikes me is, on the one hand, there's so many elements particularly when you get into talking about the brain differences. And again, because we cannot study ancient brains, but studying the differences and that question of, is there a male brain versus a female brain? But we can see these big differences in the male-female bodies. Or I guess you would say sometimes there's differences, like you're saying, immunology in men, or cancer, this kind of thing, versus other elements that are worse for women. But that there's so many areas that there how did you put that? There's less differences, that the cultural differences are bigger than the physiological differences when it comes to the human brain.
One of the things that I found, well, let me make this clear. I hated writing the brain chapter. Very, very, very much. So much hate all the time, just like rage writing for years. Okay, because I am a queer woman who sciences in public, and you don't want to give yourself the assignment of taking seriously whether or not cis women are less smart than cis men. That's just not like a thing you want to do with your time as a person like me. That's not like, yeah. And then there's a whole history of eugenics in the history of IQ stuff. And it's just, you don't want to go there. But I had to, because of course I wrote a book where each of the chapters takes a trait that we think of as really important, that places us where we are in the taxonomic tree. Had to do a chapter on lactation, all mammals. Had to do a chapter on live birth, the way we do it, and different again from the marsupials, right, with the placentals. Had to do the primate sensory array once we became primates, and on, right? I couldn't not do a brain chapter, so I did a brain chapter. And I can tell you it's one of the last that I finished, because I would continually dig into the research. I also felt more pressure, because like half of my committee is in the psych department, at Columbia University. I felt the pressure to get it right. I felt the pressure to not BS. So then I really wanted to dig into the literature, right? And so, so there I was digging into the literature and rage writing, and like, oh, you find that statistically significant, just like moving through my life like that, and then going back to other chapters to find my happy place, and then come back, and then a whole swath of eugenics, and happy place, right? So this was years and years. It took me about 10 years to write the book. I was doing my PhD at the same time, parallel, unrelated, mostly unrelated. So the brain chapter, right. One of the things I found really interesting about the brain chapter, once I got past the deeply personal rage at some of the history of science implicit in it, there's a lot of good science since then, but you have to dig into the whole history to do it, was it is actually really weird. Why aren't biologically female brains more functionally different than male brains? I mean, because there's a lot of difference in rodent models. I mean, part of that's just the pheromone thing, and part of it is just, there's just so much behavior that is so obviously innate and so obviously in response to social signaling and to this and to that. It's not hard to say which brain might be female in a rodent. But the funny thing about the human brain is that if you happen, and I don't know why you would, but if you happen to find yourself with two cadaver brains in your hands, okay? And someone's given them to you for reasons that are probably illegal, but you're holding them in your hands, and that person hasn't told you what the sex or gender of the body that produced that brain was. There is no reliable way to know. There are some known sex differences in structure, but they're region specific. So in remember, the brain isn't one thing, there are different regions, okay? So in one region of the brain, there might be a predictable sex difference ratio of white matter to, great. But in the exact same brain, we now know you'll have a different region with either a null finding or the opposite. Right? That weirdly, and it's one of the few organs in the body like this, there seems to be more of a kind of sex mosaicism, right? In structure as the brain develops, and then in its resulting functionality, which is weird and cool. Like the only way to actually know for sure, like no takebacks, like for surezies, right? Is that you need to shove the brains, or at least significant portions of the brains, in a blender, sluice them down, count your cells, and then sequence the DNA.
You never think about research like that.
But it does happen. There are very scientific blenders, okay? They're not, right? And then you're going to have to sequence the DNA a number of times from multiple cells because cis women like me who've given birth to male babies are very likely to have male cells with Y chromosomes forming independent cell lines throughout our damn bodies, producing a unique kind of maternal chimerism, which we know because we ground up and sluiced down the cells of formerly pregnant brains and found a bunch of Y chromosomes. Okay? So, which is to say that, like, that's the only reliable way to know if you do or do not have a Y chromosome, right? And if you do or do not have a typical male brain. And that was bizarre to me, you know what I mean? And the only way I could wrap my head around it, see what I did there, was to say, well, it was really important for a really long time in the hominin line to be really clever problem solvers, right? You couldn't have any member of the group less good at problem solving than another in an interdependent group. You couldn't have a whole class of folk being less, well, smart by one measure or another. That wouldn't work.
One
at
half
all.
has to carry along the other half.
Exactly. So even though slightly different mechanisms may drive some important stuff, like there are some known sex differences in major depressive disorder. There is such a thing as premenstrual depressive disorder, where people become really massively clinically depressed right around their menstrual cycle, and then we put them on birth control usually, and it can help. Sometimes it's the opposite effect. Sometimes it makes it worse, right? We're trying to figure things out in biomed space about where sex differences do and don't matter in the brain. It's not to say there aren't necessarily different mechanisms driving one thing or another, which is why different treatment paths may matter. But overall functionality, overall what we can do with the things in our head, this wetware we have, it's remarkably similar. We evolved towards sex similarity when it came to our cognition.
And I do think I'd be fascinated to see how the neuroscience research starts doing more, finding at real granular detail level, you know, for medications and things. Is there really a difference in the way something works in the male brain versus the female brain? Or is it culturally different?
And how does that intersect with cultural influence? How does that intersect with gender and what that does to a lifespan? There are all kinds of really important, nuanced questions to be asked that we're finally starting to study, but we weren't studying them before. So it is good news, but it's also a little bit like trying to fill the Grand Canyon with a bucket. It takes time, but it is good news. They're working on it.
Right, and I think that's astounding too, when you kind of go, there's so many people out there doing this work for so long, and this hasn't been done before.
It's picking up steam.
Yeah.
It's picking up steam. The
That's
NIH has done wonderful initiatives to try and get things going. Now you have to justify why, even in your basic science research, you don't have a sex-based analysis versus justifying why you do. This is good news, right? And that happened in 2013 and 15, I think. But it's worth noting that the NIH does control a huge portion of scientific funding, but nothing compared to private R&D. Pharmaceutical research is where most of the money is happening for these kinds of application spaces. Actually, the real ones holding the jewels are the editors of scientific journals.
No. I can see it. Right.
If you can't
What
publish,
gets
you can't
published,
be
it doesn't
cited.
matter. Yeah.
Yeah. And so many journals are finally starting to have in their own guidelines that
To force
you have to have a reason
Yeah. That's
to only
encouraging.
study males.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did want to get to pivot a little bit, but you started talking about the cultural aspect of it and trying to, how do we tease out what's cultural and not, in that getting to the last chapter on the idea of love. And so I think it's fun to say, okay, there's a chapter on love in a book about evolutionary, research. But I think it's very interesting the way you tackle this about saying and I guess I never thought about it this way either, that there's this idea that love is the thing that sets us as humans apart from the more primitive ape species. But you seem, if I remember right, you're saying that that some argue that the history of prostitution is the evolutionary origin of human marriage and monogamy, and that you are finding, well, not prostitution per se, but the different, what would you call it, mating rituals or something, and the evolution of that. And I thought it interesting how you studied so many different variations of the way mating behavior happens in species compared to what we've got as humans.
I got this question a lot as I was working on the book. What did we used to be like when it comes to the love and the sex and the marriage and the things, right? Depending on who was asking, there were different types of questions asked. People with scientific backgrounds would ask it in a very scientific way. People without scientific backgrounds would be like, so was it like Solomon and his wives, right?
Well, what was Lucy doing dating-wise,
Tell me about Lucy's sex
marriage-wise?
life. I had one chick ask me that, and I was like, there are things I know and I don't know. Mostly don't know. Yeah. So I would often get this question, you know, like, which is fundamentally a question of like, was it always like this? You know, is there a way of understanding the way human cultures, which are, by the way, very diverse, go about making babies and raising them, that was constant in our past? So what I usually say first is that human behavior is fantastically plastic and malleable. And simply because you look out on even all of the cultures that exist today and try and do a quantifiable something, right? And say, this is what, you know, they do, you don't actually know if in the 300,000 year history of our species that's the way it was. We have a tiny, tiny slice of behavior to work with. And by definition, all cultures that exist today are contemporary, right? No living culture is less evolved than any other. We are all each equally modern because we are alive and innovating on the cultures we're in right now. That said, there are things the body can tell you about mating strategies that maybe are better understood through the body feature itself, right? Because we do know other primate species that have certain mating patterns. For example, we know a number of incredibly promiscuous primate societies with a lot of male-male competition. We know harem-based primate societies, so that's your gorilla, right? You know, where you have the one male. No, actually, they're having a lot of sneaky sex, just FYI. There's like
that in
a
and
whole
of
lot
itself,
of that going on. But generally
mammals having
speaking,
sneaky sex.
so much,
I think that's
so much in every harem-based primate society. It's like, when do they have the time? You know, it's just, they're just doing that. Geladas, gorillas, just pretty much anything that's been discovered. But anyway, so you have that, the big dominant male and the subfemales. And in chimpanzees and bonobos, you have a lot of sexing all the time, right? Of various types. And then you have something, well, it's not primates, but you have wolves, you know, where you tend to have, and this is the mistake we make about alpha dogs, actually. It's not the case in the wild that the alpha male is, you know, incredibly dominant and all of the other males are subordinate because of pure competition. Usually he's the dad and she's the mom. That's wolf society, okay? You have two mating on top and everyone else are the kids, usually. That's your wolf society. So there are good reasons why the males are not having sex with the mom, all right? Anyway. So, but was it like that, in other words? Was monogamy in our past? And so in the love chapter, for a portion of the love chapter, I dig through our physiology and see how it stacks up. One of the most obvious signals is the balls, okay? Testicles are wildly variable in size, and they are strongly corresponding to how much male-male competition there is, simply because if you have to make a lot of sperm to blitzkrieg a cervix, as it were, sorry for the German reference these days, I know, with the fascists, but yeah. So if you need to compete with a lot of males that are also having sex with her, you're going to make a lot of sperm. Chimpanzee testicles are some of the largest you will ever see. It's amazing they can walk with these things. I mean, the knockers, it's like truck nuts. It's just what's even happening there, okay? For a body that size, you know, put that away, okay? Gorillas, harem-based, dominant male, tiny little guys, like peanuts, just not a lot happening, right? In both, penis not that big, not corresponding. But testicles, yes. And the human jewels are kind of Goldilocks, kind of not too big, kind of not too small for a species of our size, okay? So what that tells us at the very least is that if we were highly promiscuous like the chimps, which we are highly related to, right, along the hominin line, then we evolved away from some of that intense male-male competition. You're not going to keep investing in the expensive testicular tissue to make all that extra sperm if you don't need to, okay? And if we were instead a bit more like the gorilla and evolved more towards the chimp, then we moved away from the dominant male and sub-females and had a bit more of a free-for-all. We don't know which. No one knows which, but the balls tell the story, right? So that was one of the places that I looked. There are a few others: tooth size, general sexual dimorphism, and body size, but as you'll see in the chapter, but the balls were a big kicker.
Well, and I think it's just that I never think about. We can look to other things in other species, in the primate species, to get a sense of physiological elements that inform how our culture operates. We are getting close to our end time, so if folks have questions and want to come up to Jennifer at the microphone here, feel free to do that.
Please
But
do, because
while-
now's the really fun part. Now's where you ask me anything you want, and I actually answer, because I am in no way shy.
Because I have to ask polite questions, you don't.
I'll start with a question from one of our virtual viewers.
Yep.
Who asks, how long did it take you to write this book?
Oh, dear Lord, it took me 10 years. It took me 10 years. However, I was doing my PhD at Columbia at the exact same time, and I was also sort of continuously pregnant, just like I had a uterus-based hobby. I was either pregnant and then having the miscarriage and then the recovery and then deciding whether or not to be and then trying again, or I was pregnant and then gave birth and then recovering, or I was in and out of the hospital with like a lot of bleeding. It was fancy, okay? I
So
have
you
a
were your
very
own
dangerous
test
uterus.
subject.
I'd
while
be a
doing
really
it, so
good
that makes
case
sense.
subject in an
Yeah.
OB training program for like, here are a range of things that could go wrong with a uterus. But my two kids are very much alive and lovely, and according to certain states in the Midwest, I apparently have many other children in a freezer in an IVF lab that will soon be transferred for deep storage in Colorado. So, yes, so I was busy. That's how the 10 years took 10 years. But also, it's just a big subject.
I was just about to say, a very big subject to have to cover and a lot of
Not a short
research
book.
areas to get through. Go ahead.
I have a question on the very first chapter you were discussing.
Yes.
I actually met Lucy in Addis Ababa. I had no idea she had a midwife or like a. So, humans. The impression I got, humans are getting worse at birthing, right? Because the babies need help until 4 years. They, unlike other.
Along the hominin line. Along the hominin line, we're getting worse. You
Right.
mean over those millions of years since Lucy? Yeah. Okay.
So
I'm with you.
now, are you saying because of technology, we got technology as a gynecologist technology? That's how we could afford to be getting worse and worse and worse. Is that what the reason is? Like,
It does seem mysterious that we didn't go extinct. Let's put it that way. Given such conditions, right? Because remember that every human being alive today has at least some form of human gynecology. Every living culture has some practice, most of them not Western, but yeah, some practice that all together, which tends to keep the mother hydrated, works towards reduce her bleeding, works towards limiting infection risk. There are many, many things, even if you don't have a midwife in the room, that every culture in the world has to help females survive this inherently dangerous and deadly process. So we don't actually know what it would have looked like for ancient hominins to have birth problems like these without anything, right? There was, of course, a moment when it became more and more the norm to have cultural support, which becomes pseudo-medical practices around female reproduction that intervened on female fertility, sometimes upregulating it, sometimes downregulating it to help her and the offspring survive, right? To optimize, as it were. But the current death and injury rate ain't great. Even for those of us with really wonderful gynecology, and I have to say it really is wonderful. I would be so dead. I would be so deceased without modern gynecology, okay? And so many people I know would be too. So no, it's wonderful. But yes, I'm absolutely making the claim that our species The entire hominin line would have had a different trajectory without these kinds of behavioral innovations. Yeah,
So-
for sure.
A follow-up question would be, is there any advantage of getting worse and worse and worse, and evolutionarily getting worse with babies?
Oh, that's an interesting twist. There are some that claim that the helplessness of our infants ended up having a useful knock-on effect. Sarah Hrdy is one of them. She doesn't say that we specifically evolved helpless babies in order to become more socially interdependent, have more alloparenting. It's more that, like, because our babies were so freaking helpless, we became really, really good at theory of mind. We became really, really good at conveying our desires to others in our social group. We became really good at mapping complex societies. We became really good because basically our babies sucked, okay? They were wonderful, they're cute, but they couldn't do anything, right? Very vulnerable for so long. So that creates a very different sort of social organization to make that work. So her book, Mothers and Others, is a classic in the field. Sarah Hrdy, Hrdy. Look into her. But that, I don't know of anyone making the claim that making the maternal side of it so terrible would have been beneficial. I suppose you could maybe make a similar claim along similar logic, but I don't really want to do that because that's a terrible idea. I hope that was not the case. Yeah.
I'm only on page 125 of the book so far. In a nature show, a nature documentary, there was a big, huge fenced-off cage, and inside the cage in a natural environment were an entire group of macaques, I believe, that had no contact with people, and they were in situ in their own environment, but it was like caged off in a huge kind of park-like situation. So scientists came and did a research study. They brought objects into the area and recorded the response of different sexes. The women or the girl macaques, it may have been other monkeys, but they went immediately for the dolls and soft dolls that were thrown over the fence. And the males went for moving parts. There were trucks and things like that. And I was going to ask you if you could comment on that. I don't know if you're familiar with that study. I believe it's within the last 10 years or 5 years. And the second part of my question is what you spoke about how pervasive homosexuality or same couple mating or bonding is. I believe there's a small part that I read. Could you also address your thoughts on why that is part of so many species? I would be.
Ooh, those are two big, fat, meaty questions. I'm going to segment them out because they are unrelated. Okay, so the first one, this is for a very long time in human childhood, developmental studies. There was this notice of preference of play. So-called female type toys were preferred by female, so-called male type, right? And this was very much a thing in child psychology for a long time. There was this idea that girls like to play with dolls more and boys like to play with trucks more and blah, blah, gender blah. Okay, so one of the and then of course there was the question of like, well, is this a primate thing? Let's try it on the macaque. I also don't remember if it's macaque, but non-human primates. Okay. So all of this very, very interesting, but the vast majority of studies, and this was very recently corrected actually, the vast majority of studies never tested it individually. It tended to be group selection. You have a group of kids in a room, and you just map who goes for what. Or you have a group of monkeys in a room, who goes for what. When you test individually, and you give a free range of toys, not just one or the other, a free range of different types of toys, the signal disappears. The females are not particularly going for the dolls more. The males are not particularly going for the trucks more. Which is to say that it may be the case that I don't know if this means that it's all bunk, okay? I would have to look at the research more. But it does seem that we may have been testing inappropriately. Your experiment design matters, right? Very, very social animals respond to social signaling. Certainly if it was the case that one kid grabbed a doll and you're following the behavior of that kid, you might be more likely to grab the doll if you're bonded with that kid, et cetera. But again, I'm going to need to dig into the research more because I don't feel fully schooled in it. But I can tell you that that recently happened. That was a paper that came out in the last couple of years, that you have to isolate the individual and then let them freely choose without knowledge of the choices of others to actually see what's what. And it does seem to have signal disappear. So I think that's really interesting. And it certainly plays into what we're starting to learn about so-called gendered behaviors, right? That they're highly reinforced in groups, and it becomes a little bit tricky when you get into individuals. Okay, the other one is why so many animals so queer? Okay, I think basically, right? I think the short answer to that is that we have long evolved, many, many species, to have sex feel good, and we seek it. And so it shouldn't be that hard to imagine that the target of one's amorous behavior might be more flexible than the sex drive itself. I would say that. Why penguins do terrible things to dead fish, I will leave you to the wilds of the internet. I will also say that queerity in general and homosexuality in particular has absolutely nothing to do with necrophilia, that whether in our species or in others, or any of the less desirable kinds of sexual behaviors. What I mean to say is there is no correlation between being a non-heterosexual being, whether you're human or non-human, and other types of so-called sexual deviant behaviors. It seems to be a totally independent signal, with non-heterosexuality being way more common than one would think. So,
And I would say the thing that strikes me is that we think about it, okay, maybe I'm old enough to not be bearing kids anymore, but not old enough to realize that that research has all been happening very, very, very recently.
like,
I mean,
like
we
now.
are at the very baby, stages of this to recognize that, oh, homosexuality isn't just a new fad amongst humans or something, that it is something that is being seen in this whole range or spectrum in lots of other species. Therefore, we need a lot more research into it from many, many different angles.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, as a queer person who came out of the closet in the 90s, the set of language we were given to describe our own experiences was different than the set of language to describe experiences afforded to many communities now as they discover their own sexuality and orientation and what have you. And more language is a beautiful thing.
Right. And that we have
But I
certain
will say that
cultures.
means that I was more invested. There's this whole wave of research looking for like a gay gene or a smoking gun. In the 90s, there was a lot of interest in this space in human studies, very few of which produced anything meaningful, probably because identity and sexuality and culture are really complex and intersect in all kinds of really interesting ways with the rest of our lives. And there's not going to be one thing that makes you a certain kind of queer. Probably going to be a lot of stuff. I certainly can't say what one thing makes me so.
And to tease out from all the variables. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to revisit the concept of language. So one of the parameters that you used was if it conveys information. So I know it's usually a primate thing, but you use the example of orcas relaying information on how to hunt. Bees have a very intricate, very cute dance that they do to
waggles.
tell their sisters where flowers are, and it's so intricate. It says the direction from the sun to the colony, how far it is based on how many laps they do. So where's the line?
I mean, that's a great question. The waggle dances are fascinating. One of the really cool and interesting things about bees, actually, is that the vast majority of them don't live in hives. Most bee species are actually solo or semi-solo dwellers that live in like rotten logs and dirt holes in your dirt. I got one living under my mint right now back home. So that means that it isn't the case that all bee species are hypersocial, but of those who are, many species develop these really complicated waggle dances, these complicated ways of telling the rest of the hive where to go for the good stuff. And that's just one of these really beautiful cases consequences of convergent evolution. We are not very related to bees, okay? But like bees, the social bees, we do have really complex social communication. Now, you don't need human-type recursive grammar to have social communication. You don't have to have human-type language to have social communication. And in fact, social communication in incredibly complex forms has evolved many times among many different types of social animals. It's deeply a part of what it means to be social, in fact, the distribution of information.
To be social at all. And I'm afraid as we are hitting our time limit, we'll take this opportunity to communicate to you socially that we need to wrap up. There are books, if you don't already have a copy of Eve, Seminary Co-op books, wonderful bookstore is selling them out in the lobby, and Dr. Bohannon will be signing copies right down here in front, so you can go grab your copy, and we will wrap up here to do this. But I wanted to say thank you all so very much for coming out tonight. Greatly appreciated it. Greatly appreciate having the questions from the audience members. I'm not missing any from our online viewers?
We're all good.
We're good, okay.
And thank you so much to the Illinois
Thank you to
Sounds
them.
Council, to Monica, and to Cat, and for all of you being here.
Thank you.
Cat's book, of course, is available at your local Chicago Public Library, but it's so popular that there is quite a holds list for it. So if you're dying to read it immediately,
Yeah, you can either get on the holds list or get your copy.
put your hold in now. We'll start the book signing in just a minute or two, so stay seated if you want to get your book signed, and we'll get to you. Thank you.
I don't
And-
have one yet. That's the
And
kind.
if you, Illinois Science Council is doing monthly science social events, because we're